It is a hot summer day in Munich, runway 26 left, as a Boeing 787-9 from Vietnam Airlines is lining up for departure. The pilots prepared everything for their flight to Hanoi in Vietnam. However, something goes very wrong on the takeoff run, and instead of the usual 2,500 to 3,000 meter required takeoff distance, the aircraft will actually overrun the runway at the end and can only be lifted off by an aggressive pull-up maneuver that results in a tail strike. Now, before I continue with the video, I'd like to clarify a few things to avoid misunderstandings. Firstly, although I am a retired airline pilot with 30 years of flying experience, this does not make me one of those self-proclaimed aviation accident experts. Secondly, my goal with this video is not to claim that I would have handled this incident any better or more elegantly. The crew of this flight already achieved the maximum objective, namely bringing the aircraft and all occupants safely back to the ground. Lastly, my aim is simply to show what theoretically happens in the cockpit during such an emergency, and in what steps and with what priorities individual tasks are handled. Now, for those of you who don't know me yet, I am, as I just mentioned, a retired airline captain, and the last aircraft that I was actually rated on was the Boeing 787-9. As of the time of making this video on the 23rd of August 2026, no official report has yet been released regarding this incident flight. What we can say though is that the mere fact that this aircraft overrun a 4,000 meter long runway does leave us with lots of unanswered questions. Now, this incident though gives a great example of how an abnormal can not only challenge the pilots with regards to operational matters, but especially also in regards to human factors. Let's get back to the incident in Munich and allow me to give you my thoughts about the challenges this flight crew faced. But let me be clear that it is only my personal view on how I imagined to have dealt with such an incident. It is in no way any claim about how the flight crew involved actually performed their duties. Another thing to stress is the fact that I'm analyzing this in a relaxed atmosphere at my desk at home. The flight crew of the stricken flight faced a very dynamic and challenging situation, which we will get into now. Let us start at the moment the crew saw the end of the runway approaching fast and they hadn't reached their VR, i.e. rotation airspeed. This of course is a situation no pilot would ever have come across before in a real aircraft, so this has the potential to cause what is known a startle effect. Startle is a reflex, not a thought. So a loud sound, a hard jolt, a master warning tone, or a situation where you're looking in the face of potentially crashing. The signal reaches the brainstem before it reaches anything resembling judgment. The pupils widen, muscle flex, heart rate and blood pressure spike, and adrenaline releases. It's over in well under a second, and that happens to a 200-hour student pilot and a 20,000-hour check airman alike. Surprise is what follows. The cognitive scramble of reality not matching expectation. This is the part that actually costs accidents their margin. It can run for tens of seconds or several minutes. And during it, working memory narrows and attention channelizes onto one cue at the expense of the full instrument scan. Now, it's important to stress that this reaction is not a character flaw. It is a typical human reaction that can lead to many different issues. If you're interested in what exactly those are, I have covered these at the end of this video. But let's get back to the incident flight. Further video footage shows that the aircraft rotated violently, and from an inside view to the front edge of the left-hand side wing, you can see that the so-called slat autogap function activated after liftoff. And that proves that the aircraft was at a very high angle of attack setting, and so the autogap fully extended the slats to increase the wing camber and thus increasing the lift and the stall margin. It is important to note that while the Boeing 787 has a fly-by-wire flight control system and has some flight envelope protections, it does not prevent the aircraft from a stall. Unlike the Airbus A320, for example, which has a full envelope protection system and does not allow pilots to exceed the maximum angle of attack. So these few seconds from realizing the runway overrun is inevitable until having the aircraft in a very steep climb, with the airspeed being close to the flight envelope edge, poses an enormous challenge for the flight crew. So not only is the crew faced with an enormous amount of workload, I can imagine how I would have been very confused with thousands of thoughts running through my head. Like, how did this happen? Did I make a grave mistake somewhere? Why me? Will this end my career? And so on. Again, these are normal human reactions, and pilots are not immune against these thoughts and feelings. But now, the most important goal is to put all those thoughts aside and let the training and experience take over. Focus on the task at hand is what matters now. Aviate, navigate, communicate is a well-known phrase, but sometimes it is easier said than done. But in theory, aviate means that you should, of course, maintain a safe flight path, keep the aircraft within its designed envelope, and think about using automation to reduce your workload. Navigate stands for knowing where you are and know where you're going. Or simply speaking, make sure you avoid terrain, obstacles, restrictive airspaces, and other traffic. Communicate means you should contact ATC if possible, declare emergency if necessary, and ask ATC also for help. And from what I can tell, the Vietnam Airlines crew did exactly that. They got full control of the aircraft, climbed to safe altitude, and contacted ATC. However, while doing so, I would imagine the workload stayed very high. The reason being is that passing 400 feet height, the takeoff inhibition phase ends. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they had the master caution chime and maybe the tail strike message showing on the ICAS. Or you may get a call from the cabin.
Hi guys, it's Norman. Just after takeoff, the guys in the back called me. Said there was a large bang just as we were taking off with a scraping sound. Just making sure you know about this and everything's okay. Thanks.
Now, if there was an electric fault in the brake system and it activated during the takeoff run, or one of the pilots inadvertently pressed the brake pedals ever so slightly, and both of these cases are not confirmed yet, but a prolonged brake activation on the takeoff run would trigger the brake temperature message. And this would be confirmed by the gear synoptic page. Now, we stressed earlier that we have to look at the points aviate, navigate, communicate. And we've covered all the points now, really, and we're now at a safe altitude. Now, for the first time, we have to start prioritizing our tasks. And first of all, we have to look at the pressing abnormal checklists that need to be dealt with right away. And personally, I would start with the tail strike checklist. And that has to do with the structural integrity of the aircraft, and that has to be dealt with before the differential pressure gets too high. And of course, the higher the aircraft climbs up, the bigger the differential pressure will get. Looking at the Flight Radar 24 vertical path, it looks like the aircraft leveled off at 10,000 feet. The checklist for tail strike is fairly short and not complicated to follow. First, there's a caution note to let us know that after tail strike, a pressurization of the airplane can cause further structural damage. Pilots will have come across the checklist during training and know that a level off at lower altitude, preferably below 10,000 feet, in order to perform these checklist items is advisable. So then the forward and aft outflow valve switches will be set to manual control, and then both valves will be driven manually to the full open position. That means that the pressurized and air-conditioned air will flow out of the cabin fast enough to prevent a pressure buildup inside of the aircraft. Then the checklist lets us know that we should land at the nearest suitable airport and disregard the cabin altitude auto abnormal checklist. Now, in case the brakes were hot after liftoff and the brakes hot caution message shows up, then we would do the next checklist. Now, we would have to distinguish between if we're on the ground or in flight. And since we are in flight, it would tell us to go to step 6, which says we should not exceed the gear extend limit speed of 270 knots. If that is the case, then we are told to lower the landing gear. So place the landing gear lever down. And then we would wait until the brake temperature message blanks. That would be the case when the temperatures go below the limit value. And then we would have to wait 8 minutes before placing the landing gear lever up again. The reason behind the 8 minutes is the fact that the brake temperatures should be cooled down to a level where the residual heat won't trigger the brake temperature caution again once the gear is in the enclosed up position. Another checklist which may pop up in case one of the tires was damaged while hitting the lighting array is the so-called tire press, so the tire pressure abnormal checklist. Here, not much has to be done. It just says caution note. If it can be determined that the main gear tire is flat, do not use the auto brakes. Whew. Right, now we have the checklist out of the way and all is good, correct? Well, no, not exactly. There's still a lot of work to be done. So we now have to figure out how to proceed. Then we have to think about who we have to inform. For example, the cabin crew and of course the passengers. So even if only like 5 minutes have passed from the beginning of the incident, the cabin crew and the passengers of course would have a totally different time feeling as they are very anxious and worried. Now the captain is in a bit of a dilemma here because on one hand, sure, he wants to inform the cabin and passengers as early as possible to avoid further upset or even panic. The question is how much information does he or she actually have? Because we have to determine where we're going to land, if we want to reduce our landing weight, i.e. dump fuel or not. Is there a need maybe to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing? So you can see a lot of unanswered questions at this point of time. But I think it would be a good idea to inform the purser first of all, or the lead flight attendant, to give them a quick overview of what has happened and what the further intentions are. Then the purser can inform all the other flight attendants about the situation. And while that is going on, I could make a quick announcement to the passengers, again, giving them first of all some brief information about what happened, that we are currently working on the issues, and that we will come back again and give them further information about how we proceed. I think this item is very important because it signals to the passengers that yes, something has happened, but the flight crew is aware of it. They are doing the checklist, they are doing their procedures and keeping the passengers informed. With that out of the way, now it's time for our fact-finding and decision-making process. To make this a bit simpler, there are a couple of mnemonics out there, like foredeck, DODAR or decide, to name a few, which help us in this process. Now, I've grown up with the foredeck model, where the F stands for facts, O for options, R for risk and benefits, the D stands for decision, E for execution, and C for check or recheck. But before diving into this process, we would first check and have a look at and discuss how much time we have for this. Because if it's a time-critical abnormal, then we would opt for a first suitable solution. And we would not go through different options and then, discuss and decide on the best one. So here right now, personally, I would say the situation is under control. There is no real need to quickly land, which would be the case, for example, if you had smoke in a cargo compartment. So what are the facts? Well, the fact is that we had a tail strike, that the aircraft is potentially damaged, that we are unable to pressurize the cabin. That means we can't fly that far. It says land at next suitable airport. However, we have plenty of fuel, i.e. we have actually too much fuel right now and we're too heavy to land. Although you have to distinguish between max landing weight and doing a landing in an overweight landing condition. And by certification, you can land an airliner at its certified maximum takeoff weight. The only restriction there would be to land at less than 360 feet per minute. The good thing is that we have the ability here in the 787 to do fuel dumping and reduce the weight to below the max landing weight level. Potentially, other facts would be a damaged tire or several damaged tires, and potentially we may have a brake system that doesn't function properly. And here I can add that we have a quite good source of information from maintenance, where they can do an online readout of the aircraft systems, potentially, and maybe find some issues there, and then let us know how to fix them or how to deal with them. So the main focus here with the fact finding is we want to know how much landing distance we require and what our landing capability is. So how much crosswind we can accept, or if we're able to do a automatic landing or not. So once we've gathered all of those facts, that then help us to decide on the potential options. So we would have a look at what kind of airfields we have around us that meet our requirements regarding the facts that we've just gathered. Then we would look at each of the risks and benefits these different airports have. And here you could also take into account certain items like, do we have maintenance at that airport, or what about passenger and fuel handling, etc. So once everything's been weighed, then comes the decision-making process. And here it is very important that each crew member does their own personal decision-making. And so here it's very important that the captain doesn't influence that decision-making process of the other crew members. So personally, I would make my own decision mentally, but I would not let the other crew members know at this point. And then I would go ahead and ask each of the crew members for their decision. And of course, have them explain how they reached that. So of course, as the captain is the only person in the end that can make a final decision, he or she will do so and communicate that to the crew members. Now here in this example, of course, Munich will pose the best option. It's close by, it has good weather, and is one of the very few runways in Germany and around that has a 4,000 meter runway available. Actually, two 4,000 meter runways available. Then we get to the execution phase. And here, of course, being in a multi-crew environment, it's a good thing for the captain to distribute the workload and have the roles assigned as needed. So assuming that, of course, you want to reduce the landing weight to the maximum or below the max landing weight, hence you want to dump some fuel, and also maybe consider preparing the cabin for an emergency landing. The captain now has to decide which tasks to perform first of all. So let's assume we do want to prepare the cabin, hence the passengers, for an emergency landing. The cabin crew has their own procedures that they will follow, so own checklist that they will follow in this regard, in order to maybe show again where the emergency exits are located and also maybe demonstrate the safety position. So let's see what to do first, right? Do we start fuel dumping first, or do we inform the cabin first? Well, I would say, personally, I would probably inform the cabin first of all, and then inform the passengers. Let them know about our decision, that we're returning to Munich. I will estimate the landing time. And of course, I would also mention the fact that we're going to dump some fuel, so that passengers that are sitting behind the wing and then are witnessing the fuel spray coming from the wings, so that they are not unnecessarily alarmed. Yeah, quite a few things to do, right? So now let's start with the fuel dumping, or fuel jettison as it's called. But before we do that, we have to take a couple of things into consideration. So the fuel jettison must be conducted in close cooperation with ATC. They will usually assign you an area where you can do the fuel jettison. If ATC doesn't, then the captain has to find an area where there's no hazard to people or property. The fuel jettison should not be conducted below 6,000 feet above the ground, and actually it's preferable to do that at an altitude as high as possible. And that gives the fuel enough time to evaporate, and so there's no big environmental impact on the ground. Now also fuel jettison in a holding pattern and descending within the area previously used for jettison should be avoided. And that is in order to remain outside of the kerosene cloud. And of course, no surprise, you should not do fuel jettison in an area where there are thunderstorms. Now regarding the amount of fuel being able to dump per minute, if you're dumping fuel from all the tanks, so wing and center tank, the rate is about 1,360 kilogram per minute. If you only jettison fuel from the wing tanks, then the rate is about 550 kilograms per minute. So if you want to jettison about 30 tons of fuel, it will take you about 22 to 25 minutes. Right, the procedure here says, first of all, we would arm the fuel jettison arm switch. Then we would select the fuel to remain. So that way the jettison will stop automatically at the given value. And lastly, we would open both the fuel jettison nozzle valves. And then the fuel jettison will commence. Now remember that we are under the execution phase of our four-deck model. And so now, while the fuel dumping is ongoing, we can prepare everything for the landing. So we would program the flight management computer, we would calculate our landing distance requirement, we would look at the approach chart, decide on a approach minimum, and so on. Then we would do the normal approach briefing, and then afterwards the abnormal approach briefing. There we would cover everything in combination with our issues and failures. Okay, let's assume now we are coming to the end of the fuel jettison. So here it will tell us that we close the fuel jettison nozzle valves again. Select the fuel to remain off, and then also the fuel jettison arm switch back to off. And that completes the fuel jettison. By now, I would assume that the cabin crew has finished their procedure as well regarding the emergency landing. Passengers have been briefed, and so the aircraft is now ready for the approach. However, the incident aircraft actually did something which is to be expected, since they, I guess, feared that their tires or something was wrong with the landing gear. So what they did is they did 2 low approaches past the tower to have the tower check visually for any visible damage. Now, I don't want to speculate here, so we'll wait until we get the official report to see why the crew deemed that to be necessary. But for now, all we know is that the aircraft did those 2 flybys. Now, we often prepare for the worst, so we hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And in such a case where we're unsure about the state of the landing gear or the tires, then it does make sense to prepare the cabin for possible evacuation, be it via the stairs or be it via slides, whatever. Okay, so I would have opted probably for a flap 30 landing, so maximum flap landing to get as slow as possible. Touch down softly, and then assuming that auto brake was not selected, I would carefully apply the brakes manually to slow down the aircraft. Now, what we did see from another video recording is that the left-hand side main gear, 2 of the tires burst. And you would feel that in the airframe, I think, because of the vibrations. Now, something I would have done differently, maybe, I would have stayed on the runway. I would not have vacated. And the reason for this is that the taxiway is a lot narrower than the runway. And so if the fire brigade, so any of the fire trucks want to approach the aircraft, or have to go around the aircraft to get to the front. And you can see that in a minute here, where the left-hand side, a fire truck actually has to go through the grass. And so if it's very soggy, wet conditions, then I've been told those fire trucks, which are extremely heavy, may sink in and be disabled. The runway is going to be closed for a while anyways, because of all the debris that has to be cleaned. So I know the urgency pilots have to get off the runway to, have it open for other traffic. But here, under an emergency situation, take the runway. It's yours. So the aircraft is back on the ground safely. Good job. Everyone on board survived. And this could have ended so much worse on takeoff. All right, let's do a quick recap and look at the key takeaways. When an incident or accident starts, the first thing that hits is the startle and surprise effect. So what we've learned, that it is an instinctive reflex followed by a cognitive scramble that narrows attention and can degrade performance for seconds up to minutes. This is normal and not a character flaw. It is vital that the flight crew recognizes this and gets back quickly into their normal duty flows. Then aviate, navigate, communicate. Make sure the aircraft stays in its flight envelope and is clear of obstacles and other traffic. Get the aircraft to a safe altitude. communicate with ATC, declare emergency if necessary, and get help from the air traffic controller. Then have a look and see what abnormal procedures have to be done. If there are several different ones, the captain needs to prioritize according to the urgency of each of these abnormals. Once all the checklists have been completed, it's time to start the decision-making process. And here it has to be determined first of all how time critical a landing is. And that will then determine if the first available option is chosen or if the best option from a selection is chosen. So now it comes down to gathering all the facts: state of the aircraft, determining landing distance requirements, looking at approach capability, and then potential restrictions regarding visibility, cloud ceiling, and wind limitations. Depending on the situation, pilots can also tap into gathering some information via ACARS or sat phone with the technical experts at the airline. Once all the facts are gathered, it's time to search for options, mainly the airports around the current position of the aircraft, although in some situations even airfields that are not the closest may come into consideration, depending on what is needed and what's most suitable for the current issues. Now, with all the options analyzed, it's time to weigh each one regarding their risks and benefits. Then it should be easier to find the best option available and make a sound decision. And that's done by each flight crew member and verbalized. The captain has to be very careful not to influence the opinions of the other crew members. Also, he or she should be open to take in the suggestions by the other crew members. With that done, the captain will make a final decision. And that brings us to the execution phase, where the tasks are being distributed, preparations are being made, including cabin and passenger preparations, and then briefings and announcements are conducted. During the execution phase, there is a recheck of the facts in case something has changed, be it technical, weather, etc. Should that be the case, then the process potentially has to be restarted to make a new decision. And that concludes the summary of the decision-making process. So, I hope you've enjoyed the insights in how theoretically I personally would have dealt with such an incident. And I hope the point has come across on how much goes on in the flight deck with such an incident. What has to be done, what checklists have to be run, what kind of management is going on. There is a lot to do. But luckily, pilots get a lot of training and recurrent training, and also there are tools available to them to, well, manage these extreme situations. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. It helps tremendously. Also, subscribe if you want to see another video once the report comes out, the official report about what exactly has happened. And if you have further questions or comments, post them in the comment section down below. Okay. For those interested, here comes now some explanations regarding the startle and surprise effects. Although first of all, I'm going to give you a quick explanation about the electric brake system of the 787. Now, like most airliners, the 787 uses carbon brake discs. That is for heat capacity and weight savings compared to the steel brake discs. But the big difference is that the brakes here are controlled electrically and not hydraulically. And so the 787 as a whole has shifted away from centralized hydraulics towards an electric power distribution to save weight and improve efficiency and maintainability. The brakes are one part of the broader, no-bleed, more electric architecture of the 787, alongside with the electric cabin pressurization compressors, as an example, also as the electric wing anti-ice system. So the 787 uses an electric brake actuator controller, EBAC system, and each main gear wheel has electromechanical actuators, the so-called EMAs, that clamp the brake stacks directly, rather than using hydraulic pistons. The system has multiple independent electrical channels and a backup braking mode. And there's also an alternate emergency braking capability if the primary electric systems fail. And of course, like all the other airliners, it has a accumulator-like backup for parking brake function. One neat feature is the so-called taxi brake release. And so during each manual brake application, during taxi, the brake control system applies only one half of the brakes on each main landing gear. And that is if wheel speed is less than 30 knots. The system sequences through alternating the wheel pairs at each brake application, so it reduces the number of brake applications by each brake. So that covers quickly the electric brake system of the 787. And now lastly, let's get into the promised explanations about the symptoms of startle and surprise. Attentional tunneling. Focus locks onto the loudest or most recent cue while the rest of the scan goes unmonitored. Working memory load. Normally, automatic procedures suddenly take a conscious effort to recall. Steps get skipped or reordered without the pilot noticing. Negative transfer. Under load, pilots can default to an earlier learned or superficially similar response instead of the one the situation actually calls for. Psychomotor effect. Abrupt, oversized control inputs. The reflex bleeding directly into the hands before judgment catches up. And this point actually caused many accidents in the past. And then there is communication breakdown. Crew coordination degrades first. Callouts get dropped, cross-checks stop, and two pilots can act on conflicting assumptions unannounced. And then there's a time distortion. Pilots reliably underestimate how long a startle surprise episode actually lasted. Now, these symptoms regarding startle and surprise don't only happen to pilots. You may have come across that in your life as well on a day-to-day basis. However, I guess the difference is that pilots get training in this regard, and they do get a certain tool set to not only recognize these symptoms, but also then have something to mitigate them. Okay, we have come to the end of the video, and hope you enjoyed it. So until the next one, stay safe everyone, and I wish you all, as always, happy landings.